Hello everyone and welcome to part 2 of this ReeLapse tutorial series. This video is all about motion blur and light trails. So let's jump straight into ReeLapse, where I'm in the ultra wide camera to give you a good wide view of this scene. And I'm already in the effects panel here with 1 second of motion blur. But let's start from the beginning. Let's go to frames, 600 frames. I'm not here to create the nicest looking time lapses with motion blur today. I'm here to demonstrate the differences different amounts of motion blur will give you. So let's stick with 600 frames. I'm going to go for intervals of 2 seconds because we have slow moving clouds, and select motion blur of half a second. In fact, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to change it. I'm going to go for intervals of half a second. And what that's going to do is it's going to make the clouds look like they're almost not moving in slow motion. It's obviously it's a time lapse, so it's going to look sped up, but it'll look sped up in a really majestic way, in a way that they're not going to look like they're like racing across the sky. They're going to move and change in a really, well, majestic way. Let's just capture the time lapse and I'll show you what I mean. Then I'm going to capture another one with motion blur of 5 seconds and I'll show you how it compares. So I'll start with that half a second motion blur situation, and the white balance is locked. I'm going to tap to start capturing, and at half a second you barely see any motion blur. You can see it better in the water down here, not so much in the clouds, but it will have an effect when we play it back. So I'm going to be here for 10 minutes. I'm going to get a time lapse of 20 seconds, but you'll see how that changes when I select longer motion blur times. Right, that is done. Let's have a look and you'll see how the clouds are moving quickly, as it is a time lapse, but moving nice and smoothly. You can clearly see and enjoy what is happening as the time lapse progresses. And just as a reminder, this is half a second's worth of motion blur with half a second intervals, and this turned out to be quite a cool time lapse. Actually, I wish it had gone for longer now, but we must move on. So watch how the capture time changes as I change the effect, because in ReeLapse, as you add motion blur, it adds it on to the frame. So if I choose 5 seconds worth of motion blur, we're going to be here for 1 hour and 5 minutes. Now, sorry, I'm not going to be here for 1 hour and 5 minutes. I'm going to capture this time lapse for long enough for you to see what I'm talking about and how 5 seconds or longer affects your motion blur and ultimately your time lapses. So let's just hit record, and we can see it's not captured a frame yet. We're still building, and now you can see the water's really blurring, and so are the clouds. 5 seconds, these clouds are moving fast enough to actually, so you can actually see them blurring. Looks like a really cool frame. This would just be a cool long exposure. These individual frames would be cool 5 seconds long exposures. We've captured 5 so far. And what you're going to see now is you'll see the clouds just whiz across the sky. They will look smooth and they will look cool because of the motion blur, but they're going to be moving very, very fast. Right, so I ended up stopping it 100 frames, which I think works out about the same time as I captured the previous time lapse for, which was 10 minutes. This should be quite a good comparison for us. So let's have a look here in the preview, and remember this is 5 seconds worth of motion blur and half a second intervals. So have a look at this, and it's a really, really cool time lapse. Look how much faster the clouds are moving, but they're so smooth. And look at the water as well. The water just looks so much smoother than the previous one. If I swipe across, this is our previous time lapse. The clouds are moving much slower, but because there's not much the interval time is much smaller in this one, and the motion blur time is as well. The water's still moving quite rampantly, quite chaotically, which can be distracting. Whereas if I play this one again, it just looks like, oh, so nice. So let me quickly explain what's actually going on here. Now, what happens in ReeLapse, when you choose an amount of motion blur, ReeLapse extends the frames that it captures for that time, and it adds motion blur to them. It actually adds the same high quality, natural, realistic, frame averaged motion blur that you get in Reeflex's other app, Re-Expose, which is a long exposure app. So you get really high quality, noise reduced motion blur. And I think you'll agree, if we punch in to these time lapses, the quality of them is just tip top. And that's what you get from this frame averaged motion blur. So that's why when you choose intervals of half a second, the motion blur actually pumps up the capture time. Now that I've seen that and compared these two time lapses, for me, I think it's worth staying here for this amount of time to get that effect, because I actually prefer it, particularly with water. Now, that is motion blur. Now let's move on to light trails. Okay, this is the light trails section of the tutorial, coming at you from here because it was way too dark to record at the location. So let's take a look at my screen recording. Here I'm framing up with the 5x telephoto lens on the iPhone 15 Pro Max. And this is actually how not to do it, because we're losing the light. It's not quite dark yet, which is great. This is actually my favorite time to capture light trails, where you get that day to night transition. But when you do that, you don't want to lock the ISO or the shutter speed in ReeLapse, because it's not a semi-auto situation. Once you lock one, you lock the other. And as you lose the light, the exposure is not going to compensate. So the time lapse gets gradually darker, which isn't what I want. But it's fine, this is a tutorial and you can see what happens when you do certain things, so it's not all bad. Now I do lock my white balance, and there's no need to lock the manual focus because of the minimum focus distance of the 5x telephoto lens. Now, when you're selecting the length of your light trails, just like motion blur, the longer you select your light trails for, then the faster the motion is going to be, or the faster things are going to appear to move throughout the time lapse, as you will see. So I go for 2 seconds here, which I chose based on the speed of the cars moving around town. The cars are moving very slowly. They're going 10, 15, 20 miles per hour, sometimes even slower than that. And the slower the light source is moving, then the longer you can get away with your light trails. Whereas if these cars were moving 50, 60, 70 miles per hour down a carriageway, then you want like 1 second, half a second, something like that. So 2 seconds here, and you'll see how this compares to 10 seconds a little bit later on. Remember though, this is how not to do it. You can see the time lapse gradually getting darker as time goes by. Well, the light trails look great though, but at 2 seconds at this speed, the trails look more like wisps of light rather than trails of light. And this is another 2 second example. And next I've got a 10 second example, but I made a mistake here. I brought the EV down for some reason. I don't know why. I should have brought it up, because the buildings in the middle and around town are too dark for my tastes. I would have liked much more even exposure, and you can see just how much faster things appear to be moving when you choose 10 seconds, at least with the cars at this speed. And even though they do appear to be whizzing around town very, very fast, I actually prefer the look of the light trails at 10 seconds. They're actually proper light trails rather than little wisps of light. The wisps look good, but I prefer the trails. So that is the light trails and motion blur part of these ReeLapse series of tutorials. This is part 2. This video joins part 1, which was getting started, and part 3, which is motion lapses and hyperlapses. Very, very cool stuff. So I hope to see you there. It's where you capture time lapses while you are moving intentionally. Very, very nice. And it goes more smoothly than I just did there. So that's great. Thanks very much for watching. Hope you found this informative, and I'll see you in the next one.